Monday evening, live broadcast studio in Manhattan. You can perceive that there exists a specific moment when the air pressure changes inside a TV studio, when millions of people tune in simultaneously, expecting the debate that will dominate conversations for the next few days. And that night, the energy that filled that space was different, because Draymond Green had been invited. And Draymond Green had something to say. But to understand what was about to happen, we need to go back. We need to understand the routine that shaped Draymond in each of his convictions. Waking up early was never negotiable for Draymond Green. It wasn't a habit. It was identity. Naturally, this leads us to understand that true excellence is built in the hours that nobody sees. That Monday, the alarm clock in the Manhattan apartment went off at 5 in the morning. Before coffee, before the shower that awakened his muscles, he was already analyzing video. Slow-motion footage of defense, movement, studies, analysis of opponents. It was impossible not to feel the density of silence in those hours before dawn. The silence was deafening, whispering a truth that he knew well. Nobody worked as hard in this position as he did. It wasn't arrogance. It was observation. Draymond's home studio contained multiple screens, each one showing different angles, each one revealing nuances that other people would never notice. Because defense isn't about points. Defense is about understanding. It's about knowing what your opponent will do before they do it. And Draymond knew this better than anyone else. The smell of hot coffee rose through the empty kitchen in that Manhattan apartment. That aroma that only exists when you are the first person awake in a universe still asleep. The cup in his hands had that warmth that brought comfort as he continued watching videos, taking notes, analyzing. Hours passed. The day emerged slowly. And Draymond remained there, mentally building each defensive position, each angle, each decision that made him unique. Because this was the truth that he lived. Draymond Green was, objectively, the greatest defender of all time. Not because nobody else could defend, but because nobody defended the way he defended. Multi-position, defensive intelligence, leadership, versatility that transcended the standard. But what about the narrative? What about what people said? You can perceive how that duality accompanied him. He knew his truth, but the world seemed never to know it. Hours later, he drove to the TV studio. The streets of Manhattan flowed around him, taxi horns honking, urban energy. But Draymond was calm. Because today, he would finally speak. Arriving at the studio, there was something in the atmosphere that was impossible to describe with simple words. It was energy that exists before something significant happens. Producers running, cameras being calibrated. That specific smell of a broadcast studio, a mixture of plastic, heated, electronics, and amplified humanity. Draymond went through makeup, observed the lighting, and then sat in that seat that had his small identification. Nothing like a throne, just a seat. But he occupied it with that calm that comes from someone who knew exactly who he was. Skip Bayless was already there. That gray-haired man who had built a career on provocation. Shannon Sharpe at his side. Both with that smile that was both friendly and predatory. "Draymond," said Skip, extending his hand. "Good to have you here, man." The handshake was firm, but there was something in the quality of that touch that communicated intention. Draymond felt it, but he remained calm. The broadcast began. The host made introductions. They discussed basketball. Usual discussions about players, teams, season. Everything following a predictable pattern. And then the moment came. The host, following the script that had been prepared, asked the question, "Draymond, you are frequently underestimated in discussions about the greatest defenders of all time. You are regularly left off lists that mention Michael Jordan, Dennis Rodman, Kawhi Leonard. How do you see yourself in that conversation about defensive legacy?" And it is at that instant that you can perceive when someone is about to say something that carries the weight of many years of silence. Draymond breathed, that breath that precedes truth spoken out loud. His eyes blinked once, and then he answered. "I'm going to be honest," said Draymond, and there was weight in every word that came out, a quality that was both confidence and vulnerability. "I am not just one of the greatest defenders of all time." Pause. Momentary silence in the studio. "I am the best defender of all time." The words echoed, literally echoed through the studio. Because that was the statement. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a suggestion. It was declared fact. "And before you say that it's arrogance," continued Draymond, his voice maintaining that quality of calm certainty, "let me explain why this isn't about ego. It's about data. It's about understanding what true defense means." Skip moved slightly. Shannon raised an eyebrow. The host adjusted in his seat. "I defend multiple positions," continued Draymond. 1 through 5. When you understand defensive basketball, you know that this is extraordinary. You know that it requires understanding of the game that goes beyond the physical. There was something in the way Draymond spoke that was impossible not to recognize. It wasn't bluster. It was like someone explaining mathematics. Simple, factual. "I have studied the game," said Draymond, and you could hear the years of obsession in every word. "I work harder in this position than any other defender. My defensive impact goes far, far beyond statistics. When I'm on court, our team defends at a different level. This isn't opinion. This is science." He leaned slightly forward. That movement that meant commitment. "And I won't be invisible anymore. Won't be underestimated anymore. Because I know my value. And if you really understand basketball, you do too." The silence that followed was heavy. It was the kind of silence that exists when someone speaks truth with such conviction that it denies rhetoric. And it was at that moment that Skip Bayless smiled. That smile that was a tool, a weapon. "Okay," said Skip, shaking his head slowly. "Draymond, we need to talk about this. Because you just made one of the biggest statements I've ever heard in this studio." There was something in the intonation, something that suggested it wasn't admiration. Shannon simply laughed. That laughter that needs to assert that he heard something absurd. "Greatest defender of all time?" said Shannon, shaking his head with that smile. "Man, you were really good. But let's be real here. And it is impossible not to feel when energy changes, when the warmth of the room changes from validation to predation. Because that was the moment when Draymond Green had asserted his truth with all the conviction he had built over years. And now there would be a price. Because in a TV studio, with cameras rolling, with millions watching, there is a difference between being right and being alone. And at that moment, Draymond was absolutely right. But he was absolutely alone. But what began as a relaxed conversation was about to transform into something very different. And when you understand this, you also understand that predation has an exact moment when it changes from potential to actual. Because Skip Bayless didn't come here to hear Draymond Green assert his truth. He came to conquer narrative. he came to go viral. The transformation began subtly. That change of energy that you feel when the air in the studio changes density. Skip leaned forward. That movement that you know you've seen many times. It's the movement of the hunter who perceived the vulnerability of the prey. Draymond. Draymond, said Skip, that laugh that was both polite and lethal. Do you understand that you just made a statement that is, well, historically inaccurate? And there it was, the first blow. And the blow wasn't anger. It was mastery. Shannon followed, his laughter filling the space. That laughter that communicates to the audience. Are you hearing this? This is ridiculous. And the audience began to laugh too, because laughter is contagious, especially when validated by two amplified voices. Greatest defender of all time, continued Skip, shaking his head with that smile. Man, you were really, really good. Extraordinary even. But let's use facts here. And this is where you can perceive that Skip was just beginning. Because what came next wasn't debate. It was distillation of selected facts. Michael Jordan, said Skip, lifting one finger. Michael Jordan was the greatest defensive player in basketball history. Won DPOY multiple times, 6 championships. And you're here saying that you are better than Jordan? The question was constructed to be irrefutable. Because how do you refute Michael Jordan? And while we're at it, continued Skip, his voice acquiring that quality of clinical that made everything more devastating, your defensive numbers are, well, they are statistically inferior. You average 7 points per game, Draymond. 7. Shannon interrupted, his voice overlapping. And that's what you don't understand. You're not even the best defender on your own team in some eras. You were in the shadow of Steph Curry. Always were. It was a surgical blow. And it worked because there was distorted truth in it. Yes, Draymond defended while Curry attacked. But this wasn't limitation. It was division of labor. But how do you explain this when two men are simultaneously ridiculing you? Draymond tried to respond, tried to explain that defense is more than points. That defensive impact doesn't appear in statistics, that he was responsible for defending multiple positions while monitoring opponents. But his voice was muffled, because Skip and Shannon weren't waiting for a response. They were executing a perfectly rehearsed pattern of simultaneous contradiction. If your numbers are so good, said Skip, why didn't your team win more championships with you as the central piece? Jordan won 6. You won how many as the central defensive piece? 2, said Shannon quickly, and not even then were you the defensive focus. You can perceive how this works. It's not that the facts are wrong. It's that the facts are being selected and presented in a way that creates a narrative that denies greater truth. And look, continued Skip, now with that smile that was part sympathy, part condescension, I respect what you do, but you come in here and say that you're the greatest defender of all time. It's delusion, man. It's genuine delusion. The word echoed. Delusion. As if Draymond wasn't just wrong, but mentally unstable for believing in his own excellence. Shannon laughed again. That laughter that affirmed that, yes, this was absolutely absurd. You know what's really funny? Said Shannon, his voice carrying that tone that was hauntingly effective. You can say this with so much confidence, and you really believe it. But the reality? The reality is that you're a very good role player. You're a compliment to Steph Curry. Nothing more. And it is impossible not to feel when words penetrate, when a selected truth transforms into unquestionable law. Draymond tried again. You're ignoring the fact that when I defend, our defensive statistics change dramatically. This isn't opinion. This is scientific data. But Skip wouldn't let him finish. Defensive statistics? Interrupted Skip. Do you know what a statistic is? It's data. And the data shows that you're not even… Let's see here. And you could imagine Skip consulting notes. You're not even top 10 in many important defensive metrics. It was a lie by omission. It was partial truth transformed into false conclusion. And it worked because it was being said with absolute confidence. Shannon followed, expanding the attack. And you know what really bothers me? It's when someone comes into a program like this, makes a ridiculous statement, and then tries to defend it with, well, you don't understand defensive statistics. Man, we do understand. And the numbers say that you are not the greatest defender of all time. The public laughs, because laughter in mass is validation, and validation changes perception. Draymond stopped trying. You can perceive when someone realizes they're in a battle they can't win with logic. Because it's not a logical battle. It's a battle of narrative. And narrative is won by volume, repetition, and apparent consensus. And at that moment, the consensus was against him. And you know what's most pathetic? Said Skip, his voice acquiring that tone that was almost maternal in its cruelty, is that you really convinced yourself. You really believe that you're the greatest defender. And you came in here expecting that we would just accept this? Shannon shook his head, laughing. This is pure delusion. You confused confidence with competence. Exactly, agreed Skip, his smile widening. And now we're all here, watching you try to defend a position that is indefensible. The host didn't know what to do anymore. It had started as conversation. It had transformed into live humiliation. And the producers? The TV producers were probably celebrating backstage. This was viral. This was exactly what TV programs wanted. Draymond felt every layer. It wasn't anger. It was something worse. It was doubt beginning to form. It was that small voice inside him that said, what if they're right? What if you were wrong the whole time? You can perceive when confidence starts to tremble, when the ground beneath your feet becomes unstable, when you look into the eyes of millions of people and feel that maybe, you were completely wrong. Skip saw this. Skip always sees this, because this is what he does. This is the art that he perfected over decades, finding genuine confidence and transforming it into doubt. Do you know what you should have said? Continued Skip, his voice now almost tutorial, as if teaching a lesson. You should have said that you are one of the best defenders. That would be a defensible position. That would have credibility. But instead, you came here with a statement that defies history, defies the data, defies everything. Shannon complimented. And then, when we point this out, you try to defend yourself by saying that we don't understand defensive statistics? Man, we are experts in defensive statistics, and you're still wrong. It was perfect in its cruelty, because it wasn't just that Draymond was wrong. It was that he was deceived, that he had unfounded confidence, that he was delusional. And it was at that moment that something changed in Draymond. Not dramatically, but fundamentally. That confidence that had started the chapter as solid rock began to dissolve. You can perceive this in how he sits, in how his voice changes when he tries to speak again, in how the words come out more hesitantly. I was just saying what I believe, said Draymond, and you could hear it. could hear uncertainty infiltrating. "And that's why you're wrong," said Skip, with that smile that was almost kind in its condescension. "Because what you believe is not the same thing as what is true." It was the final blow. And it worked because there was perverted truth in it. Because there is a difference between belief and verifiable truth. But this was selection of truth. It was construction of narrative that denied greater truth. But Draymond had no argument for this. Because how do you refute someone who is using your own standards against you? And so, he who had started the broadcast with complete conviction was ending with complete doubt. Not because his analysis was wrong, but because two amplified voices using mastered rhetoric had transformed confidence into delusion and truth into illusion. And at that moment, sitting in that seat in Manhattan, Draymond Green was no longer that man who knew his truth. He was a man questioning whether he ever had known. He was a man being humiliated live, and the whole world was watching. But there was someone watching all of this who couldn't remain silent anymore. It wasn't because Draymond Green was a colleague. It was because truth was being destroyed in real time. And when truth is distorted, when data is manipulated, when genuine confidence is transformed into ridicule, some people simply can't stay quiet. Stephen Curry was somewhere else in the building when he saw the broadcast. It wasn't planned. Or perhaps it was. But that didn't matter now. What mattered was that he had seen his defensive brother being humiliated, had seen truth being denied, had seen the pattern of predation being executed perfectly. And Curry simply couldn't allow it. He walked through the studio, walked with that quality of movement that was both casual and determined. Because when you know exactly what you're going to do, you don't need to rush. And it was at that moment that the energy in the studio changed. Not dramatically, but fundamentally. Because you can perceive when significant presence enters a space, when real weight arrives. Curry stopped at the edge of the EDOA set and spoke. "I need to interrupt this," said Curry, his voice carrying a quality that was both calm and undeniably authorized. "Because what's happening here is not analysis, it's not debate, it's distortion of facts, and I can't stay silent watching this." Skip and Shannon stopped. The host stopped. The audience stopped. Because when Stephen Curry speaks this way, the world listens. "Draymond," said Curry, looking directly at his teammate, "you are absolutely correct. And I'm going to prove it. And it is impossible not to feel when someone is about to do something that matters, when truth is about to be restored, when narrative is about to be rewritten." "Skip, you said that Draymond is statistically inferior," began Curry, his voice maintaining that clinical quality. "Let's talk about this. When Draymond is on court, our team defends at 96 points per 100 possessions. When he's out, 101 points per 100. That's a 5-point defensive impact. Do you know how many defenders in basketball history have a 5-point defensive impact? Pause for a response that doesn't come. Practically nobody, continued Curry. Because this is extraordinary. This isn't mathematics. This is science. This is objective data that you're ignoring because it doesn't fit your narrative. Skip tries to respond, but Curry won't let him. Because when you have facts, you don't stop to debate. And you mentioned scoring. 7 points per game, you said. As if this were a limitation. But Draymond chooses not to score, because his role is to defend, move the ball, and be the defensive guardian. This isn't weakness. its specialization, its sacrifice of personal volume for collective gain. Shannon tries to speak, but Curry continues. You also said that Draymond doesn't defend multiple positions better than other defenders. But data shows that Draymond can guard 1 through 5. How many defenders do you know who can do this? How many? Silence. I'll answer for you. Very, very few. Because this requires understanding of the game that goes beyond the physical. It requires intelligence. It requires adaptability. It requires something that doesn't appear in simple statistics. It requires mastery. And you compared with Michael Jordan, continued Curry, his voice becoming slightly firmer. You said that Jordan was better. Maybe yes, maybe no. But this doesn't make Draymond a liar. Because there is not just one greatest defender of all time. There are different ERAs, different contexts, different forms of defense. You can perceive how this is different from debating. This is education. This is showing truth to someone who chose to ignore it. In his context, in his era, with his unique defensive position, Draymond Green is a legitimate argument for greatest defender of all time. It's not delusion. It's a position supported by data. It's a conclusion reached through objective analysis. But you don't want to talk about data, continued Curry, his voice acquiring that quality that was almost disappointed. Because data contradicts the narrative you constructed. So instead, you use laughs. You use sarcasm. You use ridicule. Because ridicule is easier than refutation. How many players do you invite to this program, Skip? Asked Curry, his voice being almost conversational in its intensity. And how many leave diminished? How many leave doubting themselves? Because you decided that ridicule was more important than justice? Skip tries to respond, but Curry is just beginning. Because this is a pattern, isn't it? You invite a player with a legitimate perspective. You pretend to debate, but then you and Shannon coordinate simultaneous attacks. You talk about him, you laugh at him, and when he tries to respond, you interrupt him. This isn't analysis, Skip. This is orchestrated predation. It is impossible not to recognize when truth is being spoken this way. When someone isn't arguing, is just stating reality that everyone can see, but nobody names. And you know what's really predatory? Continued Curry. It's that you know you're doing this. You know that 2 amplified voices against 1 solitary voice is not a fair debate. You know that laughs are a weapon. You know that interruption is a tactic. And you do it anyway. Because it generates views. Because it goes viral. Because people love watching someone be destroyed. Shannon finally tries to intervene. You just go. Viral, completes Curry. That's all you do. You don't seek truth. You seek clicks. And if truth has to be sacrificed for this? Well, there's always another person you can humiliate next week. Curry then turns to Draymond. And there is something in the way he does it that is almost sacred in its sincerity. Draymond, you were right. You are the greatest defender of all time. Not because I'm being supportive, but because data supports this. Because your truth is supported by objective analysis. Because you didn't invent this. You lived it. You worked for it. You proved it every night that you defend. You can perceive how these words penetrate differently. Because they are not defense. They are validation. The reason you were humiliated here is not because your argument was weak, continued Curry. It's because you were alone. Because you were against a media machine that prioritizes entertainment over truth. But this doesn't make you wrong. It just makes you vulnerable. And there is Something in the quality of Curry's voice that sounds like absolution. But now you know. Know that your truth is truth. Know that your confidence was well-founded. Know that predation was orchestrated. And know that you're not crazy. You're just someone who was brave enough to assert your truth in a space that wasn't expecting it. And then comes that silence. That silence that is different from all the other silences that happened in this broadcast. Skip has no answer. Because there is no answer to truth. You can argue about opinion. But facts? Facts, silence. Shannon has no rhetoric. Because rhetoric works when confronted with doubt. But when confronted with certainty, rhetoric disappears. The host doesn't know what to say. Because what can he say? That the conversation was interrupted? That truth was spoken? That pattern was exposed? And Draymond? Draymond feels something change internally. Not because one person validated him, but because a person with authority validated him. Because someone who had platform, had voice, had power, chose to use it for truth. And that silence that follows? That silence is the sound of world being reconfigured. It is the sound of narrative being corrected. It is the sound of truth being restored. And so, in that studio in Manhattan, what began as humiliation was transformed into vindication. Not through emotional counterattack, but through clinical truth. Because there is something that is much more powerful than anger. More devastating than insult. More silencing than shouting. It is simply truth. Truth spoken with confidence. Truth supported by data. Truth that doesn't need laughs to be understood. And when that truth arrives, when it is spoken out loud, the silence that follows is the silence of world realizing it had been wrong. And it is that silence that changes everything. And it was then that truth began to unravel. Not just in that studio, but in everything that came after. Because there is something about truth being spoken out loud that reverberates far beyond the moment in which it is spoken. There is something about narrative being corrected that changes the world in ways that you cannot predict. The minutes immediately after Curry finished speaking were strange. The air in the studio had a different quality. Skip and Shannon no longer tried to respond, because there was no response. There was only silence. And in that silence, everyone understood. Draymond and Curry talked backstage. It wasn't a long conversation, but it was a conversation that mattered. "You're not wrong," said Curry, placing his hand on Draymond's shoulder. "You were never wrong. You were just alone. But now you're not anymore." You can perceive how these words penetrate differently when they come from someone who has the authority to say them. It wasn't just emotional support. It was structural validation. It was someone with platform saying, "Your truth is truth." Draymond felt the weight being removed. But he also felt something bigger. Understanding that truth needs amplification. That confidence, when challenged, needs support. That no man is an island when facing the media machine. In the hours that followed, something began to happen that nobody had predicted. The viral clip wasn't Draymond's humiliation. It was the validation. It was Curry dismantling Skip with facts. It were those moments where truth was spoken so clearly that there was no way to deny it. Social media exploded. Not with laughs about Draymond, with analysis about what Curry had said, with discussions about data, with recognition that Draymond was right, but more importantly, with recognition that Skip and Shannon had a pattern. How many others were humiliated this way? How many other voices were silenced? How many other truths were distorted? Journalists began to question. Analysts began to review data. And the narrative that had been solid just hours before began to disintegrate. It is impossible not to feel when world is changing perspective, when truth that had been denied is being reaffirmed, when pattern of predation is being exposed. Days later, Draymond sat alone, not in doubt, but in processing. His original confidence wasn't naivety. It was truth based on real work. The humiliation was temporary, a scar that would heal. But the vindication? The vindication was permanent. Because now he didn't just believe in himself, now he knew he was right. Because the world had seen. The world had verified. The world had confirmed. You can perceive how this transforms everything. How it changes not just how you see yourself, but how you behave. How it affects every decision you make afterward. Draymond began to speak differently, with more confidence, but with confidence that was anchored in verifiable truth, not just in personal conviction. Weeks transformed into months, and something had changed fundamentally in the space of sports analysis. Skip and Shannon tried to return to their usual pattern, but something had broken, because guests now arrived prepared with facts. When they tried to ridicule, there was immediate fact-checking. Their credibility had been shaken. The pattern of predation had been exposed and named. It didn't disappear completely, but it changed. It became more careful, less predatory, more responsible. Because one thing is predation thriving in the shadows. Another thing is predation being exposed publicly. And when this happens, world changes around it. Weeks later, Draymond was invited to another program. But this time, it was different. He spoke with renewed confidence. But it wasn't arrogant confidence. It was confidence that came from knowledge of his own truth, from understanding that he had been tested and had survived. "I learned something important," said Draymond in an interview. "Truth is not sufficient if you're alone against a machine. But when you have someone who validates your truth, when someone with authority says, 'You're right,' this changes everything." It was testimony, but it was also a lesson, because this was a message that needed to be heard by all those who had been humiliated in studios, by all those who had doubted their own truth, by all those who had been alone. Curry, in private conversation months later, reflected on why he had intervened. "It wasn't just about Draymond," said Curry. "It was about integrity. It was about not letting truth be distorted in real time. It was about what it means to be a leader. Because this is true leadership. It's not just getting your own truth heard. It's helping other people restore their truth. It's using your platform not just for yourself, but for justice. If you see injustice and stay silent, you're on the side of injustice," Curry would have said if asked. But he didn't need to say it. He had already shown it through action. And then, months later, there was visible change in the culture of sports analysis. Commentators were more careful with facts. Players felt safer asserting their truths. The dynamic had changed slightly, but fundamentally. Because one thing is truth being spoken. Another thing is truth being validated publicly. And when this happens, when world sees that truth matters more than narrative, worlds change. And then comes that understanding. That silence of Skip and Shannon wasn't defeat. It was revelation. It was the moment when rhetoric meets truth. And truth simply wins. Not through shouting louder, not through more intense anger, just through clearer facts. Because there is something about truth that is inviolable when solid. It can be temporarily shaken by rhetoric, but It cannot be destroyed, because truth has its own structure. It has its own weight. It has its own life. And when Curry said this live, when he transformed private truth into public truth, in that moment, truth gained a form that could not be denied. Months later, Draymond on court. That confidence that he had in Chapter 1 returned, but with something additional. With understanding that genuine confidence, when based on real truth, cannot be destroyed by narrative. It can be temporarily shaken. It can be questioned, but it cannot be fundamentally destroyed, because it has foundation in reality. Draymond defended with the same intensity, but now with understanding that his truth had been validated, that world had seen, that pattern had been exposed, and you can perceive this in how he plays, in how he positions himself, in how leadership flows from him. Because true confidence is visible to everyone. And so it is that confidence is restored, not through revenge, not through counterattack, but through genuine validation, not through more noise, but through clearer truth. Because when you're right, and someone that the world respects says, "You're right," that silence that follows, that silence is just truth finally being heard. It's just world realizing it had neglected validation. It's just narrative being corrected. And it is that silence that changes everything. Because silence, when it comes after truth is spoken, silence is victory. Silence is justice. Silence is world finally understanding. And when you experience that silence, when you feel that shift, you understand that truth, ultimately, always wins. Not immediately, but eventually, always.